We ended our last PowerPoint on persuasive policy speeches with the idea that you need to support your speech three ways, using logos, ethos, and pathos. In this segment, we are going to talk about logos, or logic, in order to prove your point. First of all, let's take a look at what is the basis of a logical argument. The first element is that it must be reasonable. The second is that it must be rational. And the third is that it must be provable. At first glance, these might look like they're the same word, same concept. They're not. Reasonable, would this be a conclusion that your average person would come to given the same evidence? So would this be just anyone who hears this, would they come to the same conclusions that you have come to with this? A rational is more of a cognitive process. Do these come together to make sense? Does A plus B equal C? Have you made the proper conclusion here, or have you given a couple ideas or premises and come to a conclusion that really doesn't follow? Provable, can somebody else use the same evidence and come to the same conclusion with the same evidence? Or is it just a one-time thing that you put it together and nobody else could reproduce it? Next, we have to talk about the types of reasoning. We have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. A lot of people confuse these two. They're very different, and the way I approach them is different than how your book approaches it. So follow me as I go through this. And my background is in argumentation, so the view that I'm going to give you of it is a little deeper and probably a little bit more advanced than what your book has to offer. They're not wrong. They just are a little more skimming of the surface in their categorizations of reasoning. Let's start with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, I find, is a little easier to grasp. It's how we argue on a daily basis, and this is just kind of generally the way we think. It is not as strong a proof as deductive arguing is, but the deductive arguments can get a little bit complicated, so I like to start with inductive. All right, so here we have arguing from the specific to the general, and in other words, talking about something that's true in a small case in a very limited sense, and then asserting that it is always true. You can see why that might not be as compelling, because if something's true in a particular situation, it's not automatically going to be true all the time. But in essence, we're going to argue that that is how it's going to work with this type of argument. All right, so first of all, let's talk about arguing by example. So the first type of inductive argument is example. I'm going to give you a few arguments as I'm going through this and kind of explain how they work and whether or not this is a good example. First of all, my Aunt Joanne died of lung cancer at age 39. She smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day for 23 years. So what we have here, a particular person and particular actions that she did and an end result. What we have to figure out with an inductive example, is this going to be a representative of most people? If most people smoke 2 packs of cigarettes for 23 years, are they likely to die of lung cancer? And I'd have to do a little bit of research to see if this is representative. If it is, if this is a likely or probable end, then I can use it. But if this is really unusual, if this is not your typical situation, then I wouldn't want to use it. In this case, it would be a valid example because well-established research that smoking and lung cancer are correlated. So for each example, I'm going to need to ask the questions. First of all, is it typical? And does it allow for exceptions? So, as I just mentioned, this could be a typical example. Does it allow for exceptions? That means, is it that one case out of a million where it's a really unusual result? In this case, my Aunt Joanne is not an exception, so it is going to be valid. The second type of inductive reasoning is an analogy. We're going to compare one thing with another so that our audience understands it better. Let's say off-track betting in New York has proved to be successful at raising state revenues, so it will also work in Tennessee. All right, first of all, we might have a definition problem here. What on earth is an off-track betting place? This is a business where you're allowed to place bets on horse races, dog races, car races, sporting events. And in New York, you can go into these special companies and place the bets legally, whereas you couldn't do it in most businesses. So is this something that should be in Tennessee? We'd have to take a look at an analogy and see if this is going to actually be something that could work. We have to understand what off-track betting is. We have to understand how New York works and what's New York's philosophy about money, about betting, about being able to use this type of activity in order to fund other activities. And then we have to understand Tennessee. And I tell you, New York and Tennessee are some very different states, very different values and philosophies. And as I ask some questions about this analogy, that will help me determine whether or not it's going to be a valid inductive argument to use. First of all, are the two things alike in all essential regards? So New York, Tennessee, are they enough alike? And here I would probably say no, they're not. The states have very different things that they're working towards, very different philosophies of taxing, very different philosophies of raising money. And I do not think that these two states would generally be compared. If they do it in New York, well, then of course we're going to do it in Tennessee. In fact, I think that might be the opposite argument for many Tennesseans would be, well, if they do it in New York, well, then we're darn sure not going to do it in Tennessee. The second question would be, did you accurately describe both parts, New York and Tennessee, so that your audience can accept that they are similar enough to be compared? Well, in this case, I don't even need to get to this question, the second question, because I've already, with the first one, thrown out this analogy and said that's not a valid analogy to use. But let's say I did say that New York and Tennessee are very similar. Perhaps I might say, well, New York and Tennessee have very similar population rates, and because of that, it should be valid, it should be allowed in Tennessee. Well, am I telling the truth? Do we really have similar population rates? And if I have glossed over or misrepresented how they're similar, then that argument needs to be thrown out, obviously. A third inductive argument is cause and effect or causal correlation. Because we've had a dry spring, there will not be a good wheat crop this year. One thing's a cause, there's going to be a second thing, which is an effect. Another example, we could have a brown recluse spider. And when a brown recluse spider bites somebody, there is often a particular result, an effect from this. In this case, 2 small puncture wounds, tissue damage, a blister, dark serum, skin discoloration, necrosis, which is skin dying, tissue destruction. Healing is very slow. Local systems may persist. Now, if I'm going to make an inductive argument here, I look at somebody's skin perhaps and I see all of these signs and I can conclude that they were bitten by a brown recluse spider even if I don't see the spider, because I can determine the cause and effect. Now, here's another example. How do we know that exercise is good for us? And just ask you to think about this for a moment. We're told that we need to exercise. How do we know this? What is it about exercise that's good for us? That's the cause, but we're looking for an effect. What is it that exercise gives us? Maybe it gives us lower blood pressure. Maybe it gives us better cardiovascular conditioning. Does it help us live longer? Does it help people maintain a healthy weight? What is it about exercise that has that effect? And whenever we say something like, you need to exercise, we have to know what's this correlation that we're trying to bring into play here. Now, sometimes we have case studies that will help us determine what is the cause and effect. And usually with exercise, we do go back to medical studies that there have been particular cases that have been studied and then printed, published in the journals. Now, this is inductive because these are things that are true only in these particular studies, as far as we know. But if the studies were well designed, we can now say because they were true in this particular case, they're true for anyone, always. If it worked for the people in the study, it should work for everyone. That if somebody exercised and had better blood pressure, then that should work for anyone. There are a couple questions about causal correlations that we need to discuss. Is there a coherent link between the two things, that cause and the effect? It's pretty easy to find a link between two things. What's more difficult is to sometimes determine which one is the cause and which one is the effect, because they can be confused rather easily sometimes. Let's go back to that idea of exercise and the benefits that it can have. Now, there have been studies out there that have made some false connections about exercise, and we have to pay attention. How well was the study designed? That years ago in the 70s, there was a study that came out that essentially said that exercise was needed because that you could be just as healthy without the exercise, and it grew upon a population of people. I believe they were in Greece and lived very long, and it was kind of a cultural norm not to exercise. So this was there, but we didn't have a coherent link between did the lack of exercise cause the health, and later as they go back, actually the diet was the bigger, probably as they looked at it a little bit more scientifically, it was the diet that created the longer lifespan, not the lack of exercise. And we have to take a look at even that example of the recluse spider bite. If somebody has all those symptoms, they have all those effects, is the recluse spider bite the only thing that could have caused those particular symptoms? Is there a different bite that could have caused it? Do we really have proof that it's that particular one? We always have to be careful about cause and effect. TV violence and causing violence in those who watch it. This has been a great argument in the cause and effect world, because there seems to be some research that indicates that if you watch violent shows, you may tend to have some more violent actions. Seems pretty clear-cut cause and effect. People who are watching violent shows act more violently sometimes. But this is where, when we look at it a little bit closer, we can't really state what comes first. Is it that people who tend to be more violent tend to like violent shows? And so maybe the cause is actually a predisposition to a behavior, and that has had the effect of liking a particular type of programming. And it's because we don't really know which comes first that we can't make any solid arguments. One of the best studies years ago, again, this was probably in the 70s or 80s, took a look at children and had children watch two different types of programs and then analyze their behavior immediately following. They had one set of children watch Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and another watched Care Bears. And after the shows were over, they recorded them at play, and they saw the kids who watched the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers did a lot more kicking and hitting and play fighting. It was all in good fun, but they were doing these violent behaviors. Then the Care Bear kids were playing more cooperatively. We had more dolls and caring for the toys that they had. Later, it came out that they let the children choose which show that they watched, which then negated the results, which at first seemed to say the program caused a certain kind of behavior. But when it came out that the children got to choose which program they watched, then that just changed everything because, again, we don't know. Maybe the kids who like the more violent ninja type of play, they chose the particular program they watched. So the program didn't cause it. It was what they liked to watch, what they liked to do that made them choose that program. So cause and effect can be hard to use because this cause and effect then is in particular situations, and now we're applying it to everyone. It also can have some difficulties or problems with it. If inductive is arguing from the very specific and saying that the specific thing is true in all cases or in most cases, deductive is going to be the opposite of this, right? Yes, it is arguing from the general to the specific. So it is looking for a general all-around rule that we are going to apply in a specific case. And because this is trying to establish or to communicate something that's true most of the time, it is a stronger form of support if your audience accepts how you have developed these general rules. Because then if it's generally true, it's most likely going to be true in the particular instance that you're talking about, unless you're one of those odd exceptions. But if we're arguing deductive, generally we're thinking that you're not talking about an odd exception case. So if something is true in general, then it must be true in this particular case. Now, the first type of deductive argument is called a syllogism. And this is where your book slightly differs from how I'm going to present it. Your book finds, I guess, to just do the inductive and deductive alone and to put these different types of arguments into only those two categories. For some reason, the author of our book hasn't been too fond of this. A syllogism is a little bit of a confusing idea, a confusing construct, and so it's not uncommon for authors to often deal with it separately, as if it's a third form. So if we have inductive, deductive, syllogism, but from a theory standpoint, syllogism is a type of deductive arguing. In fact, it's the classic deductive argument. You remember those math problems in elementary school? And maybe some of you were good in math. You had math problems in high school as well. You have, if the train is going eastbound at 82 miles per hour and it is going to hit New York City at 8:09 p.m. and we have train B, which is traveling at 63 miles an hour, and they are going to be hitting the station at 8:10 p.m. Where will each of these trains have come from, assuming they both left at 1 o'clock p.m.? Right? I hated word problems with math. I'm not so good with numbers, but the beauty of a deductive syllogism is that there is no math involved other than using words in order to do your math problem. And essentially, in a deductive syllogism, you're going to have two premises, two ideas, and when you add these two ideas together, you have to accept a particular conclusion. So 2 plus 2 equals 4. And as long as you have your premise A is 2, and your audience believes you really have 2, and your audience doesn't think you're lying to them or deceiving them in some way, we have 2. And when you have premise B, and that's another 2, and again, if your audience accepts that your premise B is 2, and we're adding these together, you have to have 4. There really isn't another option. It's not 4 most of the time. It just is 4. 2 plus 2 equals 4 if we're talking whole numbers that are positive that we're adding together. There's only one conclusion. And a deductive syllogism tries to do this with words. So let's take a look. This is the classic syllogism that was written back in 300 BC. The first premise is that all men are mortal.
If your audience accepts this statement along with your second premise, then they're going to have to accept your conclusion. Now let's just kind of unpack this. And for a general rule, all men are mortal. This is generally true. And so we would look at this, and if I needed to prove this to my audience, I could do so. I could probably find some type of evidence to establish how many people have been born and how many people have died, minus the amount of people who are currently alive with a normal lifespan of, say, less than 150 years. If I could prove this to my audience, you have to accept that all men are mortal. Now, I could make an exception here or two, even though this is a generally true premise. I could say all men are mortal, except for, let's say, two. Let's say I'm a Christian and I have done the study in my Old Testament, and I know Elisha went to heaven, and that there are a couple of men in the Old Testament who went to heaven. Was it Enoch as well that went to heaven? I think so. So I could do a little caveat. All men are mortal, except for the two that the Bible says went directly to heaven. And in general, this is a premise most audiences will accept without you having to go back and prove it. But you can prove it if you need to in a syllogism. My premise B is going to be a smaller statement. Instead of this larger, all men are mortal, I'm going to list a particular person, in this case, Socrates. So Socrates is a man. And if I need to prove Socrates is a man, I could do this. Perhaps I could bring in his parents. If I had to, I could prove that he was born to a woman, and I guess if I had to, I could prove anatomically that Socrates is a man. But if I accept these two premises, all men are mortal, my larger, and then my smaller, Socrates is a man, I add them together. What's my conclusion? Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And essentially, if you accept A and B, you have to accept C. I could, if I had those caveats on A, therefore Socrates is mortal unless he's Enoch or Elijah. And your audience has to accept this essentially. Let's talk a little bit more about syllogisms. Let's use a basic cancer case. I started talking about Aunt Joanne, who died of cancer, when I was discussing inductive arguing. And so let's take a look at the syllogism. Premise A, smoke causes cancer. Now, if I need to, I could go back and I could establish this, that the act of lighting the tobacco causes a carcinogen. I could also just go with some of the elements in tobacco that cause cancer. But in this case, I'm making a more basic argument than just all tobacco. I'm going to be talking about something in particular that contains tobacco. So I'm just going to talk about smoke causing cancer. And if I needed to, again, I could go back and prove I could bring medical evidence in that would establish my premise A is generally true. Then I add to a premise B, cigars cause smoke. If I needed to, I could prove this so that my audience would accept my premise B. I could actually do a demonstration if I needed to. I could also bring in medical studies. I could bring in an expert. But generally, these are two things that audiences will most likely accept, so you probably wouldn't have to go back and prove them. But you can if you need to. If you have A plus B, this is going to then bring us to a conclusion. And what I want you to notice here is this is where the word problem comes in, because anytime you see the noun that is going to be repeated in A and B, here we have smoke in A. Smoke causes cancer. And then in B, cigars cause smoke. These are things that are repeated in both of these sentences. And with good math skills, when you are doing a word problem and you have a word repeated in your premises, you cancel them out. So I would cross out smoke in both of these sentences, and what I have left would be my conclusion, which would be cigars. And for the verb, you don't cancel the verbs out in a word problem. And then cancer. My conclusion is, therefore, cigars cause cancer. Now, syllogisms are kind of difficult the first few times that we talk about them, and so I'm going to give you another syllogism and have you solve this one. I'm not going to talk you through it at first. I'm going to give you the two premises, and you tell me what the conclusion is, okay? So, my premise A, all cows have 4 legs. I'm going to add this to a second premise. Betsy has 4 legs. So add these two things together and tell me what you have left. What is your conclusion? I'm going to pause here, let you fill in conclusion, what you think it is. All right, let's talk it through. We see 4 legs repeated twice, so we cross that out, and we're left with Betsy is a cow, right? That's what most people think when they look at this. That's where we jump to, that Betsy is a cow. But let's think about this. Are these premises actually correct enough that we can count on them? For instance, all cows have 4 legs. Let's be honest. Is it possible that a cow could have less than 4 legs? Well, yes, it is possible. But you know what? That's not even important, because we know in our minds that there's this exception there, but it's generally true that cows have 4 legs. The problem actually comes with this premise B. Betsy has 4 legs. When you add these two together, you don't get a definite. All you get is a maybe. Because what we should have left when we've canceled out words, we need to have canceled out a word from one of the words from before the verb and one of the words from after the verb. When we have both words after the verb that are canceled out, you just get a possible instead of a definite when it comes to these types of word problems. So Betsy may be a cow, but let's think about it. Lots of other animals have 4 legs as well. She could be a dog or cat. She could be a guinea pig. She could be an ocelot. We just don't know. This is not a valid syllogism. This is an invalid syllogism because it seems to be leading you through this word problem where A plus B equals C, but it doesn't actually do that. It only leads you to a possibility, not even a probability. So this is a type of syllogism you want to avoid. Concluding the syllogism idea, it's only valid if both premises are true and accepted by your audience, and it must be structured properly so that when you cancel out the 2 repeating words, that it does create a equal situation, that it doesn't just create a possible situation. Deductive enthymeme. Now, a deductive enthymeme can be kind of difficult for a newer student of logic to understand because essentially it's a syllogism with the premises removed. So if you get what a syllogism is, that you have A plus B equals C, an enthymeme is when you've taken away the A plus B and you don't fill the audience in on what that A plus B is. You just give your conclusion and you assume that the audience can work back in their own mind and figure out what your premises are, that it's not confusing. So if I say smoking cigarettes causes cancer, I kind of assume that you can work back in your own mind and figure out why I'm saying that. So it's what we call an implied syllogism. Just giving that conclusion, the C part of the syllogism, your audience can figure out the premises. So let's take a look at this. In the examples we've used before, Socrates is mortal would be the enthymeme that would come out of that first syllogism example from the 300s BC. And I assume that you can go back and figure out why I'm saying Socrates is mortal. Cigars cause cancer. And of course, I wouldn't do the Betsy is a cow thing because that was an invalid syllogism. Let's take a look at another one. So let's say we must eradicate social justice on Indian reservations. We have to kind of go back and figure out what might these premises be. First premise, kind of our big picture premise, social injustice must be eradicated. There is injustice, or there is social injustice on Indian reservations. Therefore, we must and so our conclusion, therefore, we must eradicate social injustice on Indian reservations. And I would assume you could go back and figure out that A and B to get to that conclusion. An enthymeme was used during the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King was leading a number of the civil protests that were peaceful. This particular enthymeme, you had men who were holding up signs that say, "I am a man," and we have M is underlined here. So what's happening with this for it to be an enthymeme? What's happening? Well, let's go back and think about it. We have all men are created equal. So we're going back to our basic documents as we founded the country. And, okay, so this was 1968 Memphis sanitation strike. And so essentially you have these men saying that, all men are created equal. Black men are men, and so therefore I am a man. This is a very powerful part of civil rights movement, and it's one that was considered fairly iconic because it made people think in a way that they hadn't before. Perhaps the racism that was so prevalent in the 60s in the United States was unthinking in many ways. People were prejudiced against those who are Black, but they didn't know exactly why, and they hadn't really thought through these premises of perhaps they thought that Black people were slightly less than human. And this brought that out, and it made a conversation of why they're saying it, and do people actually believe this? And it helped in some of the narratives. It helped some who were racist, prejudiced, but didn't really realize they were, and they didn't mean to be necessarily. It helped them put together these thoughts and go, oh my goodness, I've been wrong, and work at making changes in their own life and their own way of thinking. The third type of deductive arguing is argument by sign. And the sign, I'm happy to tell you, is the easiest type of deductive reasoning. We use it all the time, but we don't really call it by its name, reasoning by sign. But it's fairly simple to grasp, not as complex or using these odd words to discuss these ideas. I like to think of deductive argument by sign as being like Sherlock Holmes. If you've read mysteries, they often are giving you deductive signs in order to help you figure out what's happening in a particular case. So when Sherlock Holmes comes upon a smoking gun in a library, he's looking in general, what does a smoking gun mean? What does this mean when a gun is smoking? It means that the gun has recently been fired, and that's generally true. And since that's generally true, it's true in this particular case. And so this is all sorts of things. Sherlock Holmes might find a footprint underneath the window, and the footprint is in dirt that is wet, so it's muddy, and the footprint goes down 1 inch, which means the person weighs a particular amount, because in general, people who are of a certain weight would sink a certain amount in this type of material. And so because that's generally true, we can make that assumption in this case. And if it is stronger imprint on the right side than the left, then perhaps the person has a pronation or something of that sort, because that would in general mean the foot is formed a little differently, and so we are looking for a killer who happens to have a pronation of the right foot, and this person weighs 190 to 200 pounds. So generally true, and so in this particular case, it's what we're looking for. Other ways that we use signs that are not from mystery novels or mystery stories. If you come to class and you are sneezing, you're grasping a box of Kleenex in your hand, your nose is red, you look generally miserable, I will deduce by these signs that you have a cold. These are all signs that tell me in general what's happening, and I apply it to you in particular. Here's another example. Longer lines at soup kitchens are a sign of the worsening recession. The merchants downtown are beginning to close early and have installed iron grillwork on their windows. Crime must be becoming a serious problem in the community. So we're looking at signs in order to create an argument. All right, next class, next video lesson for our online class, we'll be talking about pathos and ethos. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video lecture. Bye-bye.